and on the board were 3 words. It says, "Guns kill people." I said, all right, that's going to be a good way to start off class. This is going to be a fun day.
Does he look
So
retarded or
I asked
what?
him a question. Do forks make people fat? Did my pencil give me a bad test on the last score? But what I was doing there is I was not being politically correct. Our founders weren't politically correct. And a gentleman about a month and a half ago, I know wasn't politically correct. How about that guy, I think his name's Dr. Carson? He wasn't politically correct when he had that prayer breakfast. And the next speaker will introduce him. The next speaker is Millie Hallow from the National Rifle Association. But tying both together, right now we're at a siege against the Second Amendment. Especially in our schools, there's a progressive agenda being pushed, teaching kids that you don't need to defend yourself. A government bureaucrat will save you. I think you heard about that DHS video. It actually showed them trying to get scissors to defend against an armed intruder. It's scary. And the only way to possibly protect your liberty is to have the tools to do so. And there's an old expression. Because professors and teachers nowadays are saying, oh, the Constitution's outdated. The Constitution was not written for 1776. It was written to stand the test of time. Because it details human action. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Millie Hallow from the National Rifle Association and the Vice Chair of the American Conservative Union.
He just seems so disjointed, you know, I mean, and whatever color they do have, it's all
CPAC.
up on stage or behind
Saturday
stage.
morning, we made it. Welcome to President Obama's prayer breakfast. I know it's a clever title, but please, this is going to be a great spiritual conversation between 2 extraordinary men, Dr. Ben Carson and Mr. Eric Metaxas. So, I'd like to begin with a passage from Luke 12:47. For unto whomsoever much is given shall be much required. And Dr. Carson, continuing, to whom men have committed much, much of him they will ask more. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have an unprecedented opportunity to listen to 2 extraordinary men to whom much has been given. Now, if you know Dr. Ben Carson's story, some of you might dispute the much has been given. Raised by a single parent, a mother not well educated, in circumstances where financial distress was the norm, a temper, academic struggles in elementary school, how is that much has been given? By all accounts, the early much has been given was his mom. God gave him a mom that knew his gifts, who instilled in him the discipline to realize those gifts, and it was she who helped him realize how much indeed he had been given. I know that you want to hear his story in his own words, so I won't elaborate, but Yale and the University of Michigan Medical School became part of his journey. Eric Metaxas, growing up in Danbury, Connecticut, also ended up at Yale. Maybe this panel should be entitled, God and Men at Yale. His journey was one of a very successful, eclectic writing career that brought him to understand culture versus faith. And what brings them both here today is their shared experience of having been featured speakers at the National Prayer Breakfast. Eric in 2012 and Dr. Carson just a month ago. They shared their faith, their view of life from a faith perspective, with a national audience and President Obama on the dais. Eric has written for VeggieTales.
Well, you can't
Chuck
say
Colson. He's the author
that
of
President
the New York Times
Obama is
best-selling
racist.
book right
Look
now.
what he has.
Number
People
1,
from your
Bob
own
Hoffer.
camp, highly esteemed
Those
people
3
from
things
your
are
own
not
camp.
necessarily in the same sentence. A varied career. I first read him in his series, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About God, But Were Afraid to Ask, with sequels to follow. It's a very edifying view for a Catholic girl that resisted Vatican II. Dr. Ben Carson, I know, conservative. Dr. Ben Carson is the director now of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins. The recipient of many awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He is also the author of many books and founder of the Carson Scholars Program, which motivates young people. He made medical history by leading a surgical team that separated 7-month-old twins that were joined at birth, and continues that miracle of gifted hands around the world today. Men of accomplishment, but more importantly, men of faith. These men have encountered and embraced a deep and abiding faith in God, and they lead lives that inspire and instruct us all in our own faith journeys. I, and I hope you will be, am prepared to listen, to digest, to be enlightened, to pray, and to praise. So I give you Dr. Ben Carson and Mr. Eric Metaxas.
Let's roll the windows down, turn the radio up, let the wind blow through our hair. Love is reckless. Let's get reckless tonight. Terrific. Can I come there? There ain't nothing out here but a big old Texas sky.
Eric is up first. He's ready.
Wow, God bless you, Millie. Thank you. What is this? Wow. Wow, what a pleasure to be back at CPAC. This is the third time I've spoken at CPAC, and it's the first time the crowd has been all around me. This is really, really impressive. Thank you for being here. I know that I'm here today because a year ago I was the speaker at the National Prayer Breakfast. If you have not seen that speech, please go to my website, ericmetaxas.com, and watch it. If you go to ericmetaxas.com by noon and follow me on Twitter, you will get a free Wacko Birds t-shirt. Thank you. But seriously, if you watch the speech, you will see at the end I led the audience in singing Amazing Grace. I will not do that just now, but I would like to lead you, if I could, in lip-syncing the national anthem. All right. That's a Super Bowl joke. I guess I probably need to get serious for a moment or two. Or was it an inauguration joke? I get them all confused. Yeah.
Here's where it starts getting raunchy. This is the man of Christ.
I had too much in common. Okay, to be
that
serious,
had too much in common.
Non-pejorative. Some of you know I wrote a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and it's because, thank you, and it's because of Bonhoeffer that I find myself thinking this morning and often recently about the issue of religious freedom in America. Many people have said that they see disturbing parallels between what was happening in Germany in the 30s on this issue and America today, and I'm very sorry to agree. Let me begin with my hometown, Danbury, Connecticut. Some of you, go Hatters, some of you know that Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptists in 1801 in which he uses the phrase separation of church and state. And in case there is anyone who doesn't know it, the sense in which Jefferson uses that phrase is actually the opposite of how it's generally thought of today. Today we often hear it means that the state needs to be protected from religion, and that religion should have no place in government or society. But Jefferson and the founders thought precisely the opposite. They knew that the state, capital S, was always tempted to take over everything, including the religious side of people's lives, so they put a protection in something called a constitution, capital C, that the government could not favor any religion over another and could not prohibit the free exercise of religion. Yeah.
Especially when it comes to
you're
y'all's
cheering for the
religion.
founders, not for me. They wanted churches and religions to be protected from the government, from Leviathan. Why? Because they knew that what people believed and their freedom to live out and practice one's most deeply held beliefs was at the very heart of this radical and fragile experiment that they had just launched into the world. All right, so where are the threats to religious freedom today? Well, for one thing, understand we're not talking about freedom of worship. In a speech about 18 months ago, Hillary Clinton replaced the phrase freedom of religion with freedom of worship. And my hero and friend Chuck Colson noticed it and was disturbed by it. Why? Because these are radically different things. They have freedom of worship in China. So what exactly is freedom of worship? Well, in my book, Bonhoeffer, I talk about a meeting between Bonhoeffer's friend, the Reverend Martin Niemöller, who early on in the Third Reich was one of those fooled by Hitler. In that meeting, Niemöller says something to Hitler about how he, Niemöller, cares about Germany and the Third Reich. And Hitler cuts him off and says, "I built the Third Reich. You just worry about your sermons." There, in a few words, you have the idea of freedom of worship. Freedom of worship says you can have your little strange rituals and say whatever you like in your little religious buildings for an hour or two on Sundays, but once you leave that building, you will bow to the secular orthodoxy of the state. We will tell you what to think on the big and important questions like when life begins and who gets to decide when to end it and what marriage is. And if you don't like it, tough luck. That's freedom of worship, and they have that in China, and they had that in Germany in Bonhoeffer's day. But the Founding Fathers said just the opposite. They said that faith inside that church building must live on and flourish outside that church building for the rest of the week. In fact, the founders believed that the success of the American experiment depends on precisely that. In Os Guinness's magnificent and very important book, A Free People's Suicide, he reminds us what we should already know, that the founders believed freedom of religion was at the heart of the American experiment. In that book, he talks about the golden triangle of freedom. I'll bet you never heard about that in school or in college. Just 2 generations of Americans have kind of missed this foundational principle given to us by the founders. Os Guinness explains that the founders knew that freedom and self-government were not possible without virtue. Without virtue, we would simply vote to line our own pockets and elect those leaders who would line our pockets.
That's what y'all do.
But they believed that freedom required virtue, and virtue in turn required faith. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith. It was mainly faith that motivated citizens toward virtue. So freedom required virtue, virtue required faith, but faith in turn requires freedom. The golden triangle. And the whole triangle falls apart if you take away any one of those 3 things. They support each other. Please read A Free People's Suicide, and please understand the founders' idea of ordered liberty. We have lost that understanding in America, and to lose that is to cease to be America. Chuck Colson saw some serious threats to religious freedom on the horizon, and in 2009, some of you know he led the way in drafting something called the Manhattan Declaration. If you don't know about that, go to manhattandeclaration.org. Please read it, please sign it, please tell the world about it, because already now, a few years later, those distant threats that he saw in 2009 are coming to pass. First of all, of course, there's the HHS mandate. Many people have dismissed this as something to do with contraceptives. It has just about nothing to do with contraceptives and everything to do with religious freedom. It's the issue of the government saying to a religious group that whatever you think about these issues means nothing. We're the state, and we will force you to pay for contraceptives and abortifacients. We will force you to violate your conscience and your religion. Why? Because we can. We have the power, and you Catholics are just a backward religious minority. You may know that Joseph Stalin, in a battle with the Catholic Church, once asked, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" It's an ugly moment in American history when the current presidential administration is taking a page out of the book of Joseph Stalin. When the government bullies a minority, instead of protecting that minority, that is the beginning of the end of America. We protect minorities here. So I, as a non-Catholic who doesn't share that entire view on contraception, am nonetheless obliged as an American to defend those who have those views. That's what makes us America.
And they just throw out all this propaganda, and they
We
just are so
protect
ready to
America.
believe
In America,
whatever.
we protect minorities, and we protect religious freedom
These
for all,
innuendos.
for every religion.